All right. Well, welcome everybody to Teams Nation. And my name is Curtis Johnstone. And I'm joined by three other Microsoft MVPs from Canada. We affectionately call ourselves O365A. And yes, these are Canadian hockey jerseys you're seeing. And yeah, it's something we always wear on our bi-weekly podcast. And we have a blog and a podcast. You can see the address down in the corner there. And what we try to do in that podcast is leverage our experiences to let you know in bite-sized segments new developments. We break down subjects which can be complex to help you understand them. And in the spirit of that, what we're going to do today is talk about the top 5 Teams management challenges that we've seen in the Microsoft Teams deployments that we've worked in, and give you some information, some strategies to try to help you with those issues. So we only have 40 minutes. We probably won't go too deep into any one subject, but we really hope to give you some good high-level information and guideposts to help overcome these challenges. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Habib Mankel, who's going to talk to us about challenge number 1, which is tenant drift.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. So with regards to tenant drift, obviously, as Microsoft is evolving their technology and rapidly developing and deploying features and functionality in the tenant, it's hard to keep up with regards to what is currently available in the releases that come into your tenant, and or when are they available, right? So one of the things is obviously portion of it is Teams, but it's just M365 also in general, is the tenant drift issue that that we see. So there's a few different ways or a few different methods to manage tenant drift. Obviously, the first one, you want to stay up to date with the M365 message center, ensuring that you're getting those email notifications, or you can even export those to a planner to manage the changes that you want to have. And then once though you see those in the message center, then you have to manually go and check all the different M365 portals to see whether or not the configuration is there. Sometimes it's not available through the UI and it's only available through PowerShell. So you have to have that little bit of PowerShell knowledge as well in order to get that understanding of what the feature is or when it's deployed in your tenant. And then lastly is using a tool or PowerShell module called Microsoft 365 DSC. And this allows you to export configuration into a PowerShell file, create reports, do comparison reports. You can do a few more things in it as well, but we're only going to be talking about just these little subsets. So it is managed by or created by Microsoft engineers, and then also it's in GitHub, so it's basically supported by the community. So one of the questions there is, what is tenant drift? Tenant drift is essentially, not knowing sort of the changes that are happening within your environment. So as I mentioned, as Microsoft does deployments of their feature set, you may not be aware of that feature set available within your tenant, and it may have adverse effects to your organizations because you may want to turn those configurations off or on depending on your organization requirements. So Microsoft 365 DSC, it provides a bit of a life cycle. So you can automate through Azure DevOps. You can use Azure Runbooks as well, exporting functionality, synchronization, so you can actually push a configuration to a tenant through PowerShell, and multiple tenants as well, if that's something that your organization does, maybe as a service provider. You can assess with reporting, you can monitor, and then, assess is compare, and then you have the reports that you can generate with that. So I'm going to jump right into exporting of the configuration. So if you go to export.microsoft365dsc.com, you'll get this nice, beautiful web page that they've created. And then you can specify the components that you wish to export. There's a few different things that you can do. So from a selection mode perspective, you can select light, default, or full, and it will select or unselect the options that you need. And then for authentication, there's 3 different authentication types. There's application, which is creating an enterprise application backed by an app registration in your organization using a client secret key or not. Standard credentials, username and password with or without MFA, and certificate-based authentication, which also requires an enterprise application backed by an app registration. And you notice here, it's not just Teams, but it actually includes a lot of other components. So Exchange, SharePoint, etc. And then you can select what you want to export and what really is valuable to you as an organization to want to report on. So once you've selected all your appropriate options, then you click the generate button in the top right hand corner. It will actually populate the PowerShell script for you. So you'll need to install the Microsoft 365 DSC PowerShell module and all its dependencies. And you can find that information by going to Microsoft365dsc.com. And then once you copy that to the clipboard, you can enter that information into PowerShell ISE. I'm using the credential version here, the credential portion of it. So enter my username and password. Once it does that, then I authenticate. And you can notice here that that's highlighted. It starts to connect to all the different services in the backend. 2 things to note is that Microsoft Graph will prompt you to authorize that as an enterprise application for delegated access. And same thing for PNP, because it's required to export your OneDrive and SharePoint configuration settings and SharePoint sites as well, right? And then, so once you have that configuration, as I mentioned, it exports it to a PS1 file, which is a PowerShell file. You can create a report on it. So you notice here, if you run the new M365 DSC report from configuration, you can change the type to Excel or HTML, and it will put it in a nice readable format for you or people within your organization to say, this is what my configuration is currently today, the current snapshot of what it is. But let's say I already ran one from a month ago and I want to see the differences between them. Well, they have what's called a Delta report, and you can run a new M365 DSC Delta report. You give it the source PowerShell file and the destination PowerShell file, and it will actually compare the 2 files together. And so it will say, well, last month it was this, and then this month is this. And if there's new settings that are not in it, it will say these are some settings that were in the source and not in the destination, or vice versa. So just a quick, I guess quick information on some limitations, as I mentioned. So you cannot automate the export of all workloads today. It's only because that PowerShell to Graph requirements for security and compliance and Skype for Business / Teams PowerShell module cannot be automated. So you need to use the MFA username and password ability. But if you don't need to export those configurations, then you can definitely use the application client ID and certificate-based authentication. It does require some PowerShell knowledge within the organization to run, especially if you want to build additional scripting and stuff. It does take some time to go through the export, so get a coffee when you run it. So that it does take some time. It is community support only, but the community is great with regards to responding and giving feedback on there. So it is a GitHub repository. And then if you're comparing 2 different tenants with the Delta report, it does compare the object IDs as to what it's going to compare against. So you're going to see a lot of, I don't see this in the source and I don't see this in the destination. So you need to do some manual review in that section there. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dino to talk to us about Teams third-party applications.
Awesome, thanks, Ab. So I want to talk about something near and dear to me, and that's the challenge of allowing for better user experience while managing risk with respect to Teams third-party apps. So today there's about 1,354 third-party apps in the Microsoft Teams store, which is amazing. There's lots of organizations building applications for Teams. And obviously for the best user experience, it would be ideal to just allow any user to install any one of these apps. That would be amazing, but obviously that doesn't happen day to day. So whether it's IT governance or more often, really, it's just a lack of understanding security, really. It results in, administrators blocking users from installing applications. So this is okay if there's a process in place to deal with those requests for using those applications, but often what I see in practice is many orgs don't have a process. It's just kind of like hope and pray or send an email message that never gets responded to. And this results in poor frustration and poor Teams adoption. So just quickly, for an app to be actually listed in the store, you have to go through an extensive process. So it's not a fly-by-night thing. So just to appease any admins out there that are worried about, nefarious apps getting in there, you have to go through a validation process by Microsoft. Again, it's quite extensive. They certify the application and then it gets published. You need to do some publisher attestation as well, which means you're attesting to the app doing what it says it can do. And then you even have another layer that's optional that's called 365 certification, which is one more. It's like a gold standard for applications that you can choose. So you can rest assured the applications that are in the store are generally vetted and safe. First of all, before you can even see apps in Teams, you need to turn on the master switch in the Teams Admin Center and the third-party app switch, and then you can also control whether net new apps. So, obviously, if you turned it on but you've disabled net new apps to be published, you won't see new ones that are published. So you generally want to keep both of those on so that users can even see apps in the first place. There's two kinds of permissions with respect to applications, delegated and application permissions. I'm going to be focusing more on delegated permissions today, and these are apps that basically run with you present. Application permissions are those that run when you're not at the keyboard. So these would be bots or other background services. So today we're looking more at delegated permissions. So by default, Azure controls how apps get installed in Teams. And it's not really a setting in Teams, it's a setting in Azure rather. And you can see Microsoft actually sets the default to allow users to consent for applications. It's that third radio checkbox at the top. And then it also allows Teams owners, the group owners, to also install them. So you might say, well, this is great, it'll just work. But again, most admins will turn those features off so that, typically those features would allow any application or user to install an application, which would be great. But again, that's not what we see in practice. Most of the time it's turned off. So what we do see is this kind of a setting: do not allow user consent, and that results in the user being blocked, and you get a message like need admin approval. So now I'm trying to install an application. I get this pop-up saying need admin approval. Now what? So what I recommend is allowing users to install low-risk third-party apps. So Microsoft has come up with a classification for low-risk applications, which we'll talk about. Also, I recommend considering allowing group owners to install all other applications. So if there's implicit trust in the owners of the team, often they're IT admins anyway, so that helps get around this problem. But perhaps you've educated group Teams owners to understand how to look and vet the risks associated with installing an app. So that might be an option. And lastly, have a process in place for users to request access to all other applications, whether it's offline or another process, which I'm going to show you in a bit, is ideal. So choosing the recommended options, in the first sort of screenshot, you see the middle option, which says allow users to install low-risk apps. And you say, well, what are lowest risk apps? And those are apps that don't require anything more than the 5 basic classification permissions, which I list in the second screenshot below. And these things basically just allow the application while you're at the keyboard, to read your profile. So it knows nothing more than your SIP address, your email address, your first and last name, for example, and just basic things about your profile. So it's nothing risky in that regard. So when you use those settings, that same scenario where that user was confronted with, hey, you need admin access, here they're trying to install an application called Trivia Engine. This results in the user being consented, and then they can click the accept button and the application gets installed. Again, many of the apps in the App Store are low-risk apps that will fall into that classification, so they would just work. How do you see application permissions? So you go into portal.azure.com, you search for enterprise applications, and then you search for the application in question. So in this case, I'm looking at the Trivia Engine application, which was just installed. And you can see it only required 4 of those 5 low-risk permissions. So you can always see what the permissions are for an application, just to be so you're 100% sure what's going on. So there's nothing hidden from you. Again, these are the Trivia Engine permissions. At the top, we have the 5 listed permissions, and that Microsoft considers low risk, and then you can see the 4 of the 5 that the application is actually using, just for comparison's sake. So lastly, the built-in Azure app consent process. This is a process that allows you as an administrator to let users ask you, hey, I've got this app I want to install. It requires some consent that I can't grant, so it's outside that low risk category. So how can I do that? So if you turn this feature on, basically the user says, okay, you want approval for this app, tell me why. So they've typed in, our team would like to run a sales challenge for the new product launch to increase product awareness and knowledge. So they first sort of screenshot here, they check the request approval, the request is sent to an administrator, administrator gets a message in Outlook, and they can review the request and either approve or deny it. So how do we turn that on? Again, in Azure, this is all controlled in Azure. You would go to portal.azure.com, once again in the enterprise applications bucket, and look for user settings. And then you would turn that switch on to yes. And then you define either a group of users that can review and accept applications or deny them, or just a single one. So just a quick recap here for our recommendations in terms of third-party apps. Don't just disable third-party apps in Teams. Instead, consider enabling users to be able to install the low-risk apps by default. And when you can't do this for whatever reason, security or otherwise, then have a well-defined process in place to allow the users to request the applications. Often I see there's no process in place, and again, people get frustrated. So consider using that admin consent workflow in Azure. It's free, it's there, it's easy to use and set up. So I would highly recommend using that. And with that, I'll pass it over to Michael to talk about voice management.
Thank you, Dino. Yeah, I have an easy topic to cover in a few minutes. So from a kind of complexities, voice management, really the challenge is simplifying the management complexities, right? So there's been some big changes in the last few months. And so some of these to kind of ease that complexity is around licensing. So as of March 2022, now there is the new audio conferencing license. So audio conferencing is the ability to have a bridge on your meeting, your Teams meetings that an organizer books. And so there's a new license out there that is the Microsoft Teams Audio Conferencing Select Dial Out. This is a free license. It's not automatically enabled. So it is an add-on license that you could put onto any of your licenses or licensed users that have a Teams license, so Office or Microsoft 365 licensing. The big thing here is this does replace, the paid audio conferencing add-on as well as that promo add-on that was available for the last couple of years that basically has a year expiry. The big thing here to note is those other licenses don't automatically flip over. So if those licenses, that paid subscription expires or that promo runs out, After 30 days, that feature set will be removed. So make sure that you're monitoring those expiry dates. But at any time, you can add this select dial out license to your tenant, because it's not a different license SKU name. So as long as you get that license in your tenant and you have the available quantities, once those other license add-ons expire, you don't have to do any interaction with your users. So make sure that your planning for this is not automatically enabled. You do have to acquire it. It is a free license. The other big change is for Microsoft phone system. So this has been renamed to Phone Standard. This license feature is needed regardless of how you're connecting to the telephony or PSTN network. It is included in E5, and also some other device SKUs like common area and the Teams room SKUs. It is an add-on for all the other ones. And so there's two formats of this. There's the user type license, which is Phone Standard, and then there's the Teams Phone Standard virtual user. That virtual user license is free. It is used for auto attendance and call queues, licensing the resource accounts. I'm always worried when Microsoft releases a standard version of a license. That usually means that there's a premium version coming. I've been watching the roadmap. I haven't seen anything that kind of warrants a premium version, but am keeping an eye out to see if that phone premium comes out at some point. Another thing to note is the business voice bundle SKUs have gone away. So that was the bundling of phone, standard, audio conferencing, and it could have an option of calling plans, which is Microsoft's telephony service. That has now gone away. So if you are a user, or if your organization is using business voice, you need to transition to phone standard, the free audio conferencing, and then whatever PSTN service that you're using. As we go into the Teams Admin Center, some big changes in the last few weeks. We can now manage all PSTN types or telephony types at a user level within the Teams Admin Center. This is a photoshopped image with the different UI options. Basically, if you select direct routing in the dropdown, it unlocks the ability to provide a phone number extension if you require that. It also removes the emergency address fields because that's not required for direct routing. If you're licensed for calling plans, that will be the only option in there. And then if you select calling plans or operator connect, you won't have the ability to provide an extension, and you will have that requirement to provide an emergency location. So now we can manage all service types at a user level within the Teams Admin Center. What is not available today is at the resource account. So that that account that's used for auto tenants and call queues, licensed with that free phone standard virtual user license. When you go into the admin center, there is a drop down for phone number type that includes none, online, toll-free, and on-premises, but you can only select calling plans and operator connect service numbers at this time in the admin center. Which brings us to PowerShell. So a lot of changes again to PowerShell, especially the Teams PowerShell module. Make sure you're following the message center, the release notes, make sure you're updating the module. Of course, with all these changes, that also means you have to reevaluate your scripts, may need to recode those, or look at the community, look at those scripts that the community has published to also update those. But we need to go to PowerShell whenever we're making a configuration change on the voice side that is not available in the admin center, things like unassigned number ranges, custom music on hold, but also whenever we want to automate provisioning, deprovisioning, or complete actions in bulk. This is regardless of the PSTN type. So if you're doing calling plans at mass or operator connect or direct routing, you're probably going to PowerShell. Prior, we had multiple commandlets depending on the account type, the service type. We now have a unified set and remove command for setting that number. That's that CS phone number assignment. The set runs in two modes, just enabling enterprise voice. This would be if you have an agent, if a call queue that doesn't need a phone number. The other mode is you're going to set a phone number based on the service type. If it's direct routing, you provide an extension. If it's calling plans or operator connect, you can provide an emergency address. It also enables enterprise voice, so you don't have to specify that switch with it. But similar to the admin center, depending on what service you pick, you'll have different options with that commandlet. No tel colon, so it is a difference from previous commandlets where we had to kind of put that true E164 format. We can provide numbers with a plus or without a plus. But the big thing to note is there's probably a lot of scripts that are going to be rewritten as people move to these new PowerShell modules. I know that there's some timelines on removing access on the older modules, so just make sure you're prepping for this. The last thing here is just around troubleshooting. So now that we're dealing with the complexities of voice, what happens when things aren't working as required? Maybe we have a missing dial pad for users. Maybe voicemail is not working. The call forwarding settings is not working. I like to go to the docs page because it gives you a nice table of all the self-help tests that are available with quick links. Basically, that quick link jumps into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, jumps under the support new service request, and then pre-populates the the how can we help field. You could also type it in manually, but basically once it detects that there is a self-help tool, it will provide a form of all the information that they require to run these diagnostic tests. So if I'm missing the dial pad, it'll ask me for the SIP address of the user. It'll go and do some back-end tests to see what could be the problem. Maybe enterprise voice is not enabled, maybe the licensing is wrong. This is one of the only places I've seen which will actually query the back-end like business voice directory to see if there's a replication sync issue. So great tool at your fingertips before having to create a support ticket. And with that, I will pass it to Kurt to talk about migrations.
All right, thanks, Michael. Yeah, much like Michael's topic, migrations could be quite complex. We only have a couple of minutes here, so I won't go deep into it. But my goal here is to just give you 4 pillars, key pillars of things you want to think about when you do a Teams tenant-to-tenant migration, because they are becoming more commonplace now, and more IT administrators and IT pros are getting involved in that process, whether it's a merger, a divestiture, or many companies had multiple tenants as part of different business units. So when we talk about migrations, one of the first things that is absolutely necessary to ensure a successful migration is preparation. What you want to do here, one of the key aspects of preparing for a migration is planning, and what's really required to do that planning is a good inventory of what is being migrated. So when we talk about inventory, we want to know all the content in Microsoft Teams that we're going to bring over. We want to know things like the size and details of the content, because migrations, even in medium-sized tenants, can be quite lengthy. And having the details of the content you're going to migrate will really help plan the time and length of migration, which is really needed to help for effective user communication and to just plan the whole migration. It'll also help just quantify what you're migrating in terms of apps, files that are in the Teams ecosystem, and give you a really good overview of what you're actually migrating. It'll also give you an idea of scope in terms of channels and meeting messages. And again, even in medium-sized tenants, that can be in the millions of messages. And as you'll see in the other pillars, this will allow you to make some smart choices during the migration. Another thing you want to think about in the preparation phase is matching user accounts. So part of the migration is there's an identity aspect to it, where a user in the source tenant needs to be matched with one in the destination tenant. And there's a number of ways to do that account matching. You can use different attributes on the user account, like display name or employee ID or mail address. But it's important that that matching works. That's a very common prerequisite that needs to happen to avoid migration errors. Also, you want to consider pre-provisioning the teams on the target tenant, because provisioning a team can take several hours or up to 24 hours. And if the teams aren't pre-provisioned, when it goes to actually do that migration, the team won't exist in the destination, and you'll experience errors and you'll have to restart. So after you've prepared, it's also good to think about what to migrate. What exactly do you want to bring across to the new tenant? Some things you want to pay attention to is, as you know, with Microsoft Teams, you can have apps added as tabs in channels, and the deployment of apps is gotten a lot more in Microsoft Teams. The adoption's been quite good now. There are some apps like Planner, which are absolutely critical for organizations who use it to collaborate on task planning and management capabilities. So you want to make sure that you're able to migrate that Planner content over as part of your migration to ensure that users can collaborate as they were before the migration. Another thing to think about is personal chats. For some organizations, this is an absolute must to migrate personal chats over to the destination tenant. For other organizations, especially ones with low retention on personal chats, like 1 or 2 days, they actually don't have a lot of content and they'd prefer not to migrate it. So that's another thing you want to think about, because once again, even in medium-sized Teams tenants, personal chats can be up into the millions of messages, which can greatly impact your migration. Next up, opportunities. So Teams tenant-to-tenant migrations don't happen often, and sometimes they can actually represent an opportunity to do things like merge or split channels or rename teams. You can't do that natively, the split or merge channels. So this is an opportunity to do that, and you would need support for that in your migration solution. Also, it's an opportunity to clean up some content. If your Teams tenant has been around for a while, you may have stale content. You may have teams with no owners. This is a good chance just to not migrate that content to the new destination tenant. And the less content, the better. The more content, stale content that's out there, that's a data loss risk. It can even be a security risk. So you can you even use native graph or PowerShell to find content that's old and archive it, or even remove it before the migration. Some mature migration solutions have a pre-discovery phase that can help weed out content that you don't want to migrate. So the last thing to think about is if you have especially if you have a larger tenant or even a medium-sized tenant with a lot of data, you'll probably look for a migration solution, a tool set to help you with the migration. A couple of key things you want to see if it supports. Incremental migration. So there's 2 different strategies to migration. You can do it in an incremental phase, or just a big cut over, like over a weekend. Many larger tenants require that incremental migration capability. And what needs to happen there is stuff or some content, some teams are migrated over, and then it's updated. It's incrementally updated during the whole migration. And that can ensure continuity and coexistence if you have a larger migration that's going to take longer. Another thing to think about is the storage of your data. So you don't want it at rest in any migration solution. Data at rest can present a data loss risk, and that's something you just generally want to avoid. Another thing to think about is scripting, custom scripting capabilities. Again, larger migrations, they typically have more custom requirements. Some migration solutions support the ability to use custom scripts to do things like bring in user accounts from a CSV that will be migrated in batches, and that can be really, really useful depending on your migration needs. So that was a whirlwind tour of migration, 4 key pillars to think about. And we don't have a lot of time. We have about 6 minutes left. So we'll cover our 5th top Teams management challenge, and that's shared channels, which we haven't seen this in the field a lot yet, but we're all pretty confident that this is going to be a very popular feature. It solves a number of friction points with collaboration with existing Teams model of inviting guest users into. And if this feature is as successful as we think it'll be, you really want to get in front of managing it before it's deployed in your organization. Why? Because shared channels is a new feature which could potentially expose data outside of your organization more easily to external people. And also it sort of breaks the existing Teams channel scoping, where you can have channel data in a shared channel shared outside of the team membership, which can also lead to some information protection and data loss concerns. So shared channels, it's I know there's also other Teams Nations sessions on it, so we're not going to go in depth at all here, but what we want to do, given that it's in private preview as of this month, or sorry, public preview this month, and it's GAing this year, we just want to give a high level view of, you know, two of the big control sets you can use to govern this feature. So with that, I'll turn it over to Habib. He'll talk about Azure AD as the gatekeeper of shared channels.
Gotta come off mute. Thanks, Kurt. Yeah, so for managing shared channels at the higher level, at the tenant level, you need to utilize Azure Active Directory. So Microsoft utilizes B2B for also guest access, so they call that B2B Collab. And for shared channels or Teams Connect, it's going to be called B2B Direct Connect. And so inside of your Azure Active Directory in the external identities configuration, there should be a new option in there in your tenants under preview, which is called cross-tenant access policies. And this is what's going to allow you to approve what organizations that you can have share channels with, along with other applications. So it's not strictly just a share channel capability. It's more of a global thing to say, like, what applications can users outside my organization utilize and see, and using these cross-tenant access policies to do that. So let's say you wanted to restrict organizations from adding your organization to their tenants, that you would turn on the inbound connectivity off, and then you can enable the external or outbound connectivity on, and then partner with an organization that's there. So I think you know, with that, you'll be able to manage that. So I'm going to pass it along to, I think it's Dino, to talk to us about the governance side of things.
No, it'll be my side.
Michael, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, so controlling the who. So as Hab talked about on the Azure AD level, we're controlling the external organizations that can participate in share channels. Within the Teams admin center, or within the Teams workload, we have Teams policies. These are the same policies that are used today to control the ability of using private channels. And so if you go in the Teams admin center under Teams policies, you'll typically see like a global policy, which is the org-wide default. That's where you're going to have that big toggle to turn on shared channels or disable it. Of course, you can create additional user level policies to control that aspect. Again, we can also manage this in PowerShell. Again, we need the newer versions of the Teams PowerShell module. And then during preview, which is, you know, kind of at the end of this month, there is another piece to this puzzle. During preview, you need to have the preview client to create these private channel or these shared channels. And so that means in the Teams admin center under Teams, under the Teams update policies, there is a policy where you can control who has access to that preview version of the client. And so when someone goes in and flips to the preview version of Teams client, then they can go into the channel and create that shared channel. Of course, if they're allowed to, and of course, if Azure Active Directory is permitting that. With that, I will pass it to Dino.
Yeah, thanks. And just lastly on this, as an IT admin, you want to level up on your security and compliance offerings within this. And the thing to note about shared channels is that all the information protection tools that Microsoft supports will also work with shared channels. So that's very good. So you don't have to treat these differently. You can still apply all those tool sets there. So this includes, you know, the e-discovery, legal holds, communication compliance, information barriers, audit logs, retention, DLP, and even sensitivity labels. It's not listed there, but sensitivity labels will work with shared channels. So the key to all this, just to summarize, is that the host tenant of the shared channel owns all the data and the policies that tenant applies. So if that host wants to revoke all of that stuff, basically they have the right to be able to do that. So all these policies apply only to the host tenant of the shared channel.